Good afternoon, everyone. There'll still be more people coming in, so I will drag out the introductions just a little bit to make sure everyone is here. My name is Donna Reiner. I happen to be a board member of Arizona Preservation Foundation and one of the coordinators for our webinar series. And I also want to thank our other sponsor, which is the State Historic Preservation Office. This series started no one would be surprised. It started during COVID, when, of course, we weren't gathering all in one place. And we've just kept doing it because we found that many people are at a distance from a conference site. They lack the funds to travel, etc. And sometimes we just come up with some really good ideas that no one at a conference decided to present. So this is the third in a series that is dealing with the National Register nomination. Now, if you've missed the first two, the first one was on more challenging criteria for, in that case, I think they were primarily districts. We do post those on the Arizona Preservation Foundation YouTube channel. And the one that was yesterday was on Section 7, Getting It Right. And today is going to be how to establish significance. I like to think of this, and I have worked with our presenter before, is I'm making my case. Do you like it or not? Anyway, our presenter today is Dr. Doug Kupel, who has a wide range of experiences in writing a total National Register nomination, but he does a lot with the Section 8, which is what he will be covering today. He also is a member of the Arizona State Historic Sites Review Committee. So he has some insight on when you've written what you think is really great. He's sitting there going, something's missing, or this is really great. So I want to turn it over to, the other housekeeping. We'll stay on mute until the presentation is over. If you think of a question, please put it in the chat. We will then, I will present those to Doug and he will try to answer them. You can ask some additional questions all along afterwards. But now I want to present Dr. Doug Kupel in Making Your Case.
Well, hello everyone. So I hope everyone's able to see me, and I'm going to have a slide presentation here. So let me get started with that. So it's going to do a little more here and start the slideshow from the beginning. So is everyone seeing that? Donna, can you give me a heads up? They're seeing that?
Yes.
All right, very good. Well, this is about Section 8 of the National Register form. And our topic is how to describe significance on the National Register form in Section 8. So, get going here, see if I can advance these slides. Maybe, maybe not. So, yeah, that's not really working too well for me. So, we have sort of our a mascot here, Corporal Klinger, and you know you have to be of a certain age, I guess, to understand Corporal Klinger. But he was trying to get out of the army in the Korean War in the famous movie and situation comedy MASH. So maybe some of you remember that, maybe some of you don't, but he was trying to get a Section 8 release, which is a way to get out of the army for being crazy. So that was his goal. And I don't know if you have to be crazy to understand the National Register Section 8 part, but it probably helps. So, yeah. And I guess I'm having a little trouble advancing this thing from where I'm at here. So
Are you
uh,
hitting enter?
I am hitting enter. Oh, there it goes.
Okay.
Thank you for that advice. I appreciate it. So here we go. These are the steps to describe significance in Section 8 of Form 10900, which is the National Register form. So uh, the place to start is with the Bulletin 16, Part A. So that really has everything you need to know, and it's really more of a booklet than a bulletin, and that's available online. And there's also a second bit of guidance, which is a little more concise. It's in a series called Best Practices Review that the National Register has. And so its title is How to Prepare a Concise Significant Statement. And for those of us who are reading this, significant statements, concise is definitely the key word for those. So these are the steps, and you have to identify the criteria of significance and the areas of significance. Well, there's a four criteria, A, B, C, and D. And there's 2 pages of areas of significance. So that's things like it's significant for architecture, it's significant for engineering or community planning and development. So most of those are fairly well used. There are a few ones that are less well used. The other thing that you have to include is to define the period of significance. And, a National Register property should be at least 50 years old. So, that's one end of it. And then you have to have the other end. When did it start becoming significant? Then you have to develop a historic context. And we're going to be going through all these things individually. This is just the introduction. So uh, don't fret. The historic context, there's 3 parts to historic context. A time, location, and theme. So that has to be described, but essentially just describing in more detail why it's significant. Then you have a narrative argument, and really that's the history part of it. The town was founded, and this house was built by one of the founders, and that kind of thing. It's a narrative history of the property. And then you have to address integrity, and that is whether or not the property still conveys its significance. And so there's 7 aspects of integrity, and those are increasingly significant today because a lot of National Register nominations become planning documents, especially for local preservation organizations and historic districts, local historic districts. So integrity is a big thing. And there's also what are called the criteria considerations if needed. Now, there's some exceptions. Now, some properties are not allowed on the National Register for certain purposes, religious properties, um, graves, burials, birthplaces, memorials, statues, recent properties. So, of course, you have to draw the lines somewhere. So, if you allowed everything, it would be huge. So, there's some limits to it, but there's also exceptions to those limits, and those are called the criteria considerations. And then finally is the summary paragraph. And you notice I put the summary paragraph at the end. Now, that's not where it goes in the form, so don't let that throw you. It's actually the first thing in the form, but I'm recommending to you that you save it for last once you've done all these other things because it's a summary paragraph, right? And you can't just summarize anything until you've written it. So save it for last and then put it at the beginning. So get everything together first. So let's see here. There we go. This is working now. Thank you, Donna. So here is that a summary statement of significance. So you'll see this normally at the front of the documentation. That's why I'm putting it front, but we'll return to it. But you notice here, it talks about the 59th Avenue Residential Historic District, significant under National Register Criterion A. That's the criterion for its association with community development. That's the area of significance in Glendale. And of course, this is Glendale, Arizona. And then there is a historic context that describes that significance, which is residential development in Glendale, 1895 to 1955. So you see probably when it was founded and then when it ended, period of significance. And it has a second area of significance under architecture. So it's also significant under criterion C as being representative of architectural styles in Glendale. So that's a second area of significance. And then there's a second context about residential architecture in Glendale, 1910 to 1955. And you notice there's a little difference there in the dates because there was some activity in platting the development before there actually had some buildings built. And it does have a summary of the period of significance here, and it has why. You also have to say why. It starts when they planted a series of palm trees and ends when the last available space was filled with a home. So if you've ever been to Glendale, Arizona, and you go down 59th Avenue, you will see those row of palm trees there on the west side of 59th Avenue. It's a very distinctive look. So let's go ahead and begin. We're going to march through these various pieces here, and we're going to start with the criteria. And this picture is of the city county building in downtown Phoenix. And uh, a lot of people may not know this, but it was built to house both the county offices and the city offices. So about 1/3 of it was the city, and 2/3 of it were the county. So give you a problem right there. Is it the county building? Is it the city? What's it significant for? Well, mainly significant for architecture, right? Because it's a very a nice looking Art Deco / Spanish Revival building. So it's definitely architecturally significant, but also something you can't see is it was the location of the trial for Ernesto Miranda in 1963. And this is the famous case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court about the Miranda warning. So you have to give people who are accused of a crime, now you have to give them a warning, which you've seen on every TV show since the 1965 or 66 Supreme Court decision. You have the right to remain silent. And you have the right to an attorney. And if you can't have an attorney, one will be appointed for you. So that's another significant aspect of this building, not readily apparent. So there's a lot of things that are significant, but there's actually only 4 according to the National Register. And these are listed here. Criterion A is associated with events that make a significant contribution to history. We call this one the broad patterns of history. And for historic districts, this is often the criterion that's used. Community planning and development, broad patterns of the development of this community. So that one is probably the biggest target if you're going to want to choose one. The second one is criterion B, associated with the lives of significant persons. And you think, well, there'd probably be a lot of them. But I have to warn you, this is a more difficult one to prove because which property? People move around a lot. They live in different places. So which of the person's property? It has to be the single most significant one, and it has to be most significantly associated. So that's a little bit tough. And then furthermore, it has to be associated with the period of that person's significant contributions. So a boyhood home is not necessarily going to be eligible. And then criterion C, this is the architecture criterion: design, construction, distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. Also, it could represent the work of a master. And so when we say a master, we're talking about a master architect, a Frank Lloyd Wright, for example. Again, pretty self-evident if it's architecturally significant, but for the work of the master, then it has to be kind of compared to the other properties. And then criterion D is the archaeology criterion. And really, it doesn't say archaeology, it says important in prehistory or history, and is likely to yield information important. So you notice in parentheses there it says information potential. So again, a little trick to this is because you have to show that there's archaeological deposits at the site that have that ability or have yielded important information. In other words, significant artifacts, features, patterns in the soil, that kind of thing. So it's really not enough that it's evident it's an archaeological site. It has to have that potential to yield, is what we call that. Now, another tip, you don't have to have all four. If you're nominating your property, that's not required. You only have to have one. And so a lot of people uh, get sort of caught up in the excitement of it, and so they're writing and writing, writing, and they get several criteria, but that's not required to get it on the National Register. So sometimes our advice to folks is uh, drop one of those, focus on the most important and most clear, because there's no need to overdo it, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Now, you can put that information in there, but if you haven't proven your case, then it's a red flag to the reviewer. They could reject it saying, well, you didn't prove your case, I'm going to send it back to you. So you don't want that to happen. So lead with your best criterion. So here you go. Here are those areas of significance that I mentioned there. There's 2 pages of these things. They're on pages 40 and 41 of National Register Bulletin 16. And so we just sort of touch on a few of these according to the criteria. And if it's a criterion A, your broad patterns, your events in history, there might be a significant event there. So you would choose, for example, a transportation down here. If it was a railroad station, if it was a trolley car, something like that. As we talked about, we have, this is our favorite catch-all here, community planning and development, which is also a criterion A. And this is just the development and physical structure of communities. And so, that's your neighborhood, your historic neighborhood, your local historic district, all those kinds of things. So that one is, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's probably easier than proving up some of these other ones. So a criterion B, that one is the significant person criteria. And so what you have to look for there, you have to choose which of these areas the person was significant or known for. For example, if it was an artist, they may be significant under the significance area of art because they were a famous painter or sculptor or something like that. They could be also under literature, creation of prose and poetry, They could also be under politics and government. If they were a political theorist, if they were a statesperson, if they were a governor or a president or that kind of thing. So you want to go through these and pick those things out for criterion B. Now criterion C, of course, they have a separate one for architecture. That's easy. They have a separate one for engineering. So usually engineering applies to a structure, right? A bridge, for example, some other type of a structure, railroad, tracks, that kind of thing. And of course, architecture normally is buildings. They define it here to serve human needs. So I don't know, a doghouse is probably not going to make it, but these are your famous buildings, Taliesin West, the City County building in downtown Phoenix, all those significant for architecture. That's usually readily apparent. And then here again, the last one, criterion D, this is for archaeology. And again, this is the ability to yield important information. So you're going to have archaeology here. They've divided it up into some categories, but generally speaking, the study of prehistoric and historic cultures through excavation remains and the analysis of their remains, right? So that's the potential to yield. You have to be able to demonstrate there's still deposits there that are going to yield important information. So a prehistoric irrigation system, prehistoric site, Casa Grande down there in Coolidge area. It could be what they're calling Aboriginal here. These are for cultures after the Advent. In other words, during the historic era where you have written records, ethnographic analysis would be appropriate then. And then also non-Aboriginal cultures. This is your historic archaeology, of which there is plenty. So those are the areas of significance. And so I'm seeing a few things in the chat here, and just a reminder, we're going to have questions at the end, so I'm happy to answer questions about any of this. I see, having done a lot of teaching, I always stop and ask for questions. And so I kind of feel like I should do that, but I know, uh, that's not our format here. So, um, anyway, hold the questions, put them in the chat as you think about them, and then we'll get to them at the end there. Okay, so next part is the a period of significance, and this is always has to be very readily apparent to the reviewers, a starting date and ending date. And generally speaking, a property has to be at least 50 years old to be eligible to be listed on the National Register. And there are exceptions, and we'll talk about those later. But it needs a beginning date and an ending date. So this is a photo of the Glendale, Arizona beet sugar factory. And that's where they took sugar beets, which they grew in the Glendale area, and mashed them all up and made sugar out of it. Sugar beets. So it's a little odd in the nomenclature, but they call it the beet sugar factory because they're making sugar from beets. So they're making beet sugar as opposed to cane sugar, which is made from sugar canes. So it's a little weird how the nomenclature goes and which comes first and which comes second. But this was built over a period of years, but between 1903 and 1906. So that's when it was constructed. So that'd be the first dates for the period of significance. And it's still there. And no one has found a good adaptive use for this building. So it still sits there, and it's a huge thing. It would be great to turn it into something, but it would cost a lot of money. So it still sits there. No person or developing group has ever found the money to have an adaptive use for that poor building. So if you have any ideas, though, I'm sure everyone is open to hearing those things. So a period of significance. And so what you have to do, it's an exact time frame when the property made its important contribution. So a beginning and an ending, a date are necessary. And like a lot of other things, it depends on the criteria as to what you're going to focus on in the date. So if it's a criterion A property, again, this is the broad pattern category, the significant event category. So if there was maybe a labor strike and this was a union building where they had the leadership of the union that led the strike. So maybe the strike lasted 5 months, and so maybe that is a 5 month period. Maybe it's very short like that. But usually they're quite a bit longer, and normally if it's a building, when it was constructed, like a beet sugar factory, and then when it was no longer being used, or at the end of the 50-year period of significance. Criterion B for significant people, then it's usually the length of time the property was associated with the significant person. And, there's some other ramifications there. It has to be really the one property most significant and most significantly associated with the person. And then it has to be associated with that person's significant uh, period, right? When they were productive, their productive life. So that's to narrow off, people that lived in many houses, and a lot of people do, as you well know. So it's to sort of not have everything. George Washington slept here, right? Just because he slept there, that doesn't make it significant. Mount Vernon, yeah, but the inn down the highway on the turnpike, no. So the length of time the property is associated with that person for criterion B. Now criterion C, a little bit simpler. It's architectural significance, right? So when does a building become architecturally significant? Well, when it's constructed, right? Is going to be constructed. It usually is a whole. There's obviously modifications and things. But when it's constructed, that's the date of significance. So maybe it just has a single date for the period of significance. A lot of times there may be significant additions to a building, significant modifications. So if those are also significant, those dates could be listed as well. But keep in mind, they have to be within that 50-year time period. So a recent addition would not be part of the significance unless there's an exception. And that happens, but more on that later. And then finally, criterion D, archaeological sites. And here is usually the time period for when that culture was present at the site. And so normally for an archaeological site, that's a wide range of years. And because they have different methods of dating archaeological sites, prehistoric archaeological sites, carbon 14 dating, for example, X-ray fluorescence of obsidian and things like that. So it could be a range, from 3,000 years before present to 2,500 years before present, or from 3,000 years before present to, you know, 1400. So uh, it just is a range, but there should be some archaeological reason for picking those dates, right? The basis, ceramic, evidence, things like that. So another little thing to consider, periods of significance, and we've talked about historic districts, right? Local districts and neighborhoods that are historic. And there is a little wiggle room there, a little exception. So normally all the properties should be at least 50 years old. But realize the neighborhoods don't develop all at once, right? They develop over time. Uh, there's exceptions there, but you have a big developer does them all in a year or two. But for the most part, it's subdivided, and people have their homes built, and they gradually build up, and eventually all the vacant lots are filled with houses, and then at that point, people normally say, "Well, it's reached build out." Right? So the neighborhood is built out. And a lot of times this date could straddle the 50-year period, right? So if you have most of the properties are built at least 50 years ago, and let's say there were a few lots that weren't built out at 50 years, and maybe over the next 2 or 3 years, those were also built out. So it's all within a unit, relatively speaking, right? So it's pretty much close enough, as they say, close enough for government work, right? So if it's close, there's some leeway there for neighborhoods when they're reaching build out. So there we go. So the next part is the developing the historic context. And so I mentioned at the beginning in the introduction of these various pieces we're going through, historic context has a time period, it has a geographic location, and it has a theme, or like an area of significance, right? So there's the three parts to it. And so this is a photograph of the Elias Rodriguez house in Tempe, a very old adobe building, built about 1882. And this was along an early canal in Tempe, and it's really built before the subdivision was even platted. And the subdivision gets platted afterwards. And, you know, this was a rare survivor, an adobe building that survived all that time to the modern era. So it has a criteria there, adobe architecture, another one, association with the Hispanic development of Tempe. So time period from 1882 onward. And so those are the elements of the historic context. And so those have to be fleshed out in a context statement. And that should be a separate thing and separately identifiable. And you recall when I was reading the one about the 59th Avenue Historic District in Glendale, we had a context for community development and a context for architecture. So you would have the same thing here for the Elias Rodriguez house and your property too. So here you go. You're placing the property in a broader historical, social, architectural, physical context, right? So you're really talking about that area of significance, the broad context. And then that's the theme part of it. And then you're going to describe how it relates to the community, state, or nation. That's the geographic part of it, right? It could be a local context, it could be statewide, it could be national. The Miranda decision there in the city county building, nationwide significance, right? And then you have the time period, right? And the time period is the last one. Uh, so you want to bracket that out, usually with the period of significance that you develop for the property. So those are the three parts of the historic context. And so just to go through those again, the cultural theme is really the what of the context, the specific trend, pattern, or theme in history. For example, agricultural development, uh, 20th century commerce, ethnic heritage. These are the broad themes really corresponding to those areas of significance. And then the next part, the geographic area where this thing played out in a specific city, county, region, or state. And then that chronology, the time period. When did these events take place? And so those are all put together to create a narrative. And this will be, depending on how prolific a writer you are, a few pages long. So here's an example: residential development in Phoenix from 1900 to 1940. That's a historic context. And so you have that, and then you start writing about it. It's a residential development. It's in Phoenix. It's from 1900 to 1940. Those are your parameters. And so then you write the historic context, and really it should be persuasive, right? Because you're trying to show how building is significant. All right. So that's the historic context part of it. And the next part is the narrative argument. And really, this is more of your standard history of the building, how it was built, when it was built, how it fits into the town or location. So this is your normal kind of history that people are familiar with. So this is the auditorium for the Levine School in Levine, Arizona. So it's listed on the National Register. It doesn't look like too much in this picture, but it is a significant building. I'm not a big fan of the the ADA approved entrance on there, but uh, forget about that when you start thinking about integrity because it's already listed. So let's move past this photograph. um, so here you go, a narrative argument. You're going to have a brief chronological history of the building. You're going to talk about the area of Levine in Phoenix and, how it got founded and, who lived there and why and that kind of thing. And then you're going to get down to the specific property. Well, this was a school property. You had a school district established in this particular year, and they bought this land for the school in this other year, and the school board had a decision. And so all these things are various dates and historical facts you can amass and write a story about how the building was built. And then you can also talk about the area of significance there. Obviously, this is significant for education. Not so much for architecture. It's not that that stunning of a building, but it was built by a federal program, right? It was in the 1930s, and so federal funds paid for it, and so that's an area of significance for this school. And then you have to talk about the physical features of the property here to connect it up. So, made of adobe, for example, uh, roof construction had a certain type of roof, that kind of thing. So, this is overall, uh, the regular history part of the document. So here, just some excerpts of this nomination. So, just so you know, there's some websites on the internet, of course, about the National Register. There's two websites, and so they started doing it one way, and that's the National Register database. So if you want to look up a National Register nomination that's relatively old, you go to that website, an older nomination, and then they started doing a new website, the National Register Gallery, and that one has a more recent nomination. So when it was written, not the date of the property, when it was written. So you have to go to two places if you're really doing thorough research, and of course I recommend that. But you can point of this story is that you can go there and get a copy of of a nomination, right? And take a look at it and see how people did it. And I'm not saying the ones I'm using as an example are the best necessarily, but since I wrote them, they're pretty good. Right? So I like to think so anyway. So here's a Levine School, and so this is a summary paragraph, and it's maybe a little wordier than how I would write it nowadays. Generally speaking, it should be more similar to that the 59th Avenue one that I used at the beginning of the presentation. That one is better because it's more concise, and you know the problem people have is they go on and on, right? It's a summary paragraph, so don't go on and on with it. Get to the point, touch on all those things that we highlighted, and then you're done with the summary paragraph. So that's why I say, write it last after you know all those things. And then here you go. Here's that narrative, right? The narrative argument. And this is the early development of Levine. It was in Maricopa County in the Salt River Valley. It takes its name from the Levine family, and they moved out there, and a lot of da goes on and on about Levine. So that's really that narrative that I was talking about. And, it could be the early development of Tucson, uh, early commerce in Phoenix, you know, uh, the Transcontinental Railroad, whatever is the narrative. So that's sort of the history part of it that people are familiar. But then you go over here and you're going to have these historic contexts, right? And so that's really when you're getting into the significance, right? So this is a little blurry. I'm hoping you're able to read it, but it's talking about is significant under criterion A as an example of the trend for rural school construction in Arizona. So here you go, rural school centralization in Arizona with the date. It's also considered significant under criterion A for it's a federal works project administration and building. So it's really the narrative is not exactly tied into the significance, but the context definitely should be. So there's the first context there, and of course it continues on, and here's the second context there, significantly associated with a second historic context, the construction of the Works Progress Administration WPA buildings in Arizona from 1935 to 1943. So you have a date range there, you have a geographic location. Whoops, got a little carried away there. Uh, you have a geographic location, Arizona, and then you have the theme here, construction of works project administration buildings. So, and again, these don't have to be overly long, uh, but they have to be persuasive. So, this is an exercise in persuasive writing. Okay. So, marching on here, we're doing very well on time here, so we're probably going to have plenty of time for questions. So, hang on to those, get them in the chat, and we'll be addressing them at the end here, which probably won't be too long from now. All righty. So, integrity. So this is a big deal in the National Register program. And it's a big deal because you don't want a building that doesn't look like a historic building on the National Register. So you've all seen some bad things happen, some very good buildings, right? They get modified, changed. They no longer look like a historic building. You can't tell if it's a historic building. So generally, the rule of thumb that we like to use is if the person knew the historic building during the time, historic period, and they went forward in time and looked at the building again, if they could recognize it, maybe it still has an integrity. So I don't want to call out Donna too much, but she has done a recent thing where she's going back and looking at some historic era buildings in Phoenix, and you would know they're historic because they've been changed so much. The facade's been changed, it's been stuccoed over, or they've put a lot of stuff on it, so it doesn't look historic. So that's the rule of thumb. But it's more specific than that. And so that's why I've put this preservation brief number 17 here. And it's to talk about architectural character and which visual aspects of a building are important to preserve the architectural character of the building. And so that's a very important aspect now. So, of course, that Bulletin 17 is available online, as everything is nowadays. But integrity is you have to explain how the building retains enough of its historic character. And they have 7 aspects of integrity, right? Location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, and association to convey its significance. And so, yes, there's 7. And should you address all of them? Yes, yes, you should. So that's what it is. And so a lot of them, what they're looking for, are what we call nowadays a character defining features, right? So if you think about a character defining feature of Spanish colonial architecture, for example, well, it's going to have a red tile roof, right? Those barrel tiles. It's going to have maybe arches. It could be constructed out of adobe. Uh, So it could have a certain form to the design where it's built up to the edge of the property line, and a lot of the activity is in a courtyard in the middle of the property. So these are just the character defining features of that style of architecture and that era of architecture. For it to be significant example of that architecture, it has to retain those character defining features. And as I said at the beginning, this becomes a more and more important as we have more and more local historic districts and we have a local design review. That is something that the planners are looking at closely, because the idea is to preserve the overall character of the neighborhood. And through these individual buildings and the integrity of the individual building. So, you know, as you get projects that come in to the design review, they're going to look at it and say, well, you're going to lose the character here. You're replacing the windows, that's changing the character. You're infilling the porch, that's changing the character. You've lost the roof material for a certain type of building. The roof material is significant, that kind of thing. So it's challenging there. So just to go through these things, location, of course, is it still on the location where it was constructed, right? So generally speaking, there's exceptions, but eh, to maintain integrity of location, it has to be where it was built originally, right? And then design is the next one. And again, a lot of this is oriented toward architecture, as you can see. Design as well, does it still reflect the intent of the designer? In other words, the architect. Or has it been changed so much that it doesn't look like a significant representative of that architect's work anymore? And setting is the surrounding area. And so, you know, you might have a property that was in a rural setting, agricultural setting, something like that. But now the city has come in and encroached upon it. And so it's on the side of a major road now. Because in the old days, they had 40-acre plots of land for farms and they built the house in the corner. Well, now that corner is, like a big intersection in the modern city. So maybe the setting has changed so much. It doesn't look historic in that area. The materials are what the building was built of, or the structure. The best example is, of course, adobe. If it was built of adobe and now you put an addition on there that's not adobe, it's changed that. If you change out the windows and you put a modern window in there that doesn't look historic, or even if it does, it may have an impact on integrity, right? Vinyl window, that kind of thing. And then workmanship. And of course, you know, they've changed how they build houses, right? The tract homes. They do those almost like an assembly line in reverse. They send the workers past the lots, and each set of workers does a different thing. And so I'm not criticizing their workmanship, but it's not the same workmanship as we had in the past, where you might have a crew working on a single house or a single building for a certain amount of time. And, they had the time and ability to put special details in the building, and crafts work and built-in cabinets and other little elements that are not seen in modern construction or modern architecture, where everything is prefabricated and bought from a large supplier. I'm not going to name names, but yeah, you get the idea. So that's workmanship. And then the feeling, obviously, feeling is a little hard to describe, but really, is it evocative of a historic feeling? And so, a little hard to tell there, but a couple of examples. And I don't know if you have, but one of the best examples is Fort Bowie in the eastern part of Arizona near Wilcox. And this was a U.S. Army fort during the period of conflict uh, between Native Americans and settlers in Arizona. And so they built forts, the Army did. And this one was sort of left to lie in ruin, right? It was adobe constructed, but essentially abandoned and left to sort of deteriorate. And it's still there, and you can still see the outline of the fort and the various buildings and things. But when you go there, you have a very evocative feeling of a history, right? That, yeah, this was uh, a fort, and you have a huge feeling of age there. So you really get a nostalgic feeling when you're there at Fort Bowie. Another example, and we'll have a couple of pictures of this at the same time period, period of conflict between settlers in Arizona and Native peoples. From uh, after the Civil War to the end of the century there, but centered in the 1870s, 1890s, is a location where Geronimo agreed to lay down his arms. And it's in a very remote part of Arizona, Skeleton Canyon, way down in the southeast corner of Arizona. But there's a mound of rocks there, and these rocks were built up at the time when Geronimo agreed to lay down his arms as a marker of this historic event. And at the time, people recognized how historic it was, and they were waiting for relief, and they were waiting Geronimo and his people to be transferred to the railroad, and unfortunately for them, sent away from Arizona for a long, long time. But that again, very evocative of a feeling there. And finally, a little more direct association. So it has to be associated. There has to be some physical, uh, tangible association with the historic event. And so, it had to have happened there. The property has to be significant there. So to go back to the labor unrest and, the labor union hall, decisions about the strike had to have happened there. Uh, you know, Not an Arizona example, but in California, we have it's called 40 Acres. It was where the headquarters of the United Farm Workers was, and all the decisions there, Cesar Chavez and the group, the farm workers, the union, were made at that 40 Acres facility. So it has a strong association with the actual events itself. So a lot to unpack with the integrity, but I do encourage you to check out that uh, brief there about architectural character, and understand that nowadays the character defining feature, those have to be present, and they have to be related to the significance in order for it to have integrity. So if the feature that's lost isn't related to the significance, then maybe not so much. And the other thing to consider about integrity, and I'm going on a lot about integrity, and of course we do, and we get to our meetings, we go on and on about integrity. Uh, it has to be related to that area of significance, right? And so, if it's a Criterion C nomination for architecture, it's pretty strict. If it's lost integrity for architecture, it's not going to make it. But let's say it's community planning and development. And yeah, it's an old building, architecturally significant maybe, but it's lost some stuff. It's lost a few things. Well, maybe it hasn't lost enough where it's no longer significant for community planning and development. So there's a little bit of a grace there, depending on the area significance and the area of integrity that could be lost. So I keep that in mind. And a lot of times, and I hate to reveal our secrets, but uh, if you have an area that has maybe some weak integrity for architecture, you might nominate it under community planning and development, and we often do because the integrity of the individual buildings is less important in a situation like that. So uh, a little pro tip there for you. All righty. So moving on, I hope you're all still out there hanging tough with me. So this is the location I was telling you about earlier. This is the location where Geronimo agreed to cease hostilities against the army and the settlers and lay down his arms. And for his troubles, he was sent to um, Oklahoma, where he spent the rest of his life there, along with his family and other Apache people. So this is obviously on the one side an old photo of this mound here where they erected this, and like I said, they had some time on their hands, so they piled this up. They knew it was a historic occasion, and it's still there. And there's a more recent photograph when this location was identified, and it's actually listed on the National Register now uh, at the national level of significance. So you have to have a level of significance. You have to clearly state if it's whether local level, state, or national level. And so that one, the Geronimo site, significant at the national level. So here's a couple other ones. This one here is up at the Sunset Crater. Well, before they landed a man on the moon, of course, we haven't landed a woman on the moon yet, but before they landed a person on the moon, they had to train for that. And they found Arizona to be a pretty good a substitute for the moon, right? Very rocky, barren of vegetation, volcanic. And so they sent the Apollo astronauts up here to practice walking and practice driving their lunar modules, which would be sent into space into the moon. And it's a national historic district now. And it's listed on the National Register at the national level of significance. So here's another one, again associated with some federal government activities. This is the Fort Tuthill Historic District, which was a National Guard training facility from 1929 through 1949. And up in Flagstaff. And we had a state National Guard, still do. This was named after an adjutant general of their Arizona National Guard, Tuthill. And that one's where the Bushmasters trained. And so the Bushmasters is the 158th Infantry before and during World War II, a very highly decorated outfit. And of course, Tuthill, very significant leader. And so because this Arizona National Guard is listed at the state level of significance. So just a couple examples there. And of course, local level is significant to the local community, the city or town or rural area where it's located. So again, the three factors there: local, associated with local events, activities, and persons, important to local history. And most properties have local significance. And there's a few that have a state significance. These are events, activities, people that reflect the history of the state. Certainly, General Tuthill, certainly the Arizona National Guard, statewide significance there. And then national significance associated with the history of the nation as a whole, contributing to exceptional way of our history. And, the Apollo 11 guys training here in Arizona and, going to the moon after that training, yeah, national significance. And one thing people may be confused, there is a National Historic Landmarks. That's a separate program from the National Register. So there's a separate process. They call it the designation. A National Historic Landmark is designated, and it's a rigorous process, takes 2 to 5 years. And so a lot of folks think, well, if it's listed national significance on the National Register, it automatically goes on National Historic Landmarks. That is not the case. So that's a common point of confusion. It's a separate process. So, all righty. Now we're going to move into the criteria considerations. And uh, these are those exceptions which I've mentioned and hinted at several times. And so there's a list of types of properties that are not normally eligible for the National Register. And again, the basic reason is you have to have standards, right? It's the National Register after all, so you can't put anything on there. So there's certain things that they sort of ruled out because they're so numerous, or that they have, a separation of church and state issues, that kind of thing. So they tried to rule those things out to kind of avoid a controversy, is the idea. And so there's actually a couple of National Register of bulletins that are useful here. The first one is National Register Bulletin 15, which is how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation. And that's just in general, but you want to start with that one because that covers all of them. And then there's a specific one about properties that achieve significance in the recent past. That's a Bulletin 22, guidelines for nominating properties that have achieved significance in the last 50 years. So that one, if that's your case, you want to look at that one. And they also have another bulletin number 41, guidelines for evaluating and registering cemeteries and burial places, which are not normally eligible for the National Register. So the picture chosen here is a Methodist Episcopal Church in Glendale, Arizona. So it's not listed on the National Register for a religion. It's listed for its architectural significance and for its significance to the community planning and development of Glendale, Arizona. So that's how you get around the exceptions, right? Is you're nominating it for something else, right? And we'll talk more about that here in just a minute. So here are a couple of examples. Here, of course, is the Grady Gamage Auditorium at the campus of Arizona State University, a Frank Lloyd Wright designed building, but built after his death, but listed on the National Register very, very quickly because it's Frank Lloyd Wright after all. And on the other side, this is Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman Supreme Court justice, and a view, obscure view of her home in the back of that, which was over there in the Tempe, and was eventually moved to be close to the Arizona Historical Society Museum in Tempe. So this is a moved property, and of course, the moved properties are not normally eligible for the National Register, but it's Sandra Day O'Connor, right? The first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. So super significant. So even so, the building was moved, is still significantly associated with Justice O'Connor. So that too got listed on the National Register. So I'm going to run through these criteria considerations here for you, just so you know about them. They are also lettered A through G, so it causes a little confusion with the criteria for evaluation. But the first one is A, that's a religious property, right? So normally religious properties are not eligible for listing, except if they have their primary significance from architecture or artistic distinction, or they have historical importance, right? So an example, I don't have a picture of it in the presentation, but the Chapel of the Holy Cross in Sedona, right? A very significant architectural building. The next one here, B, criteria exception B, is one that's removed from its original location, but is primarily significant for architectural value. So if you have an architecturally significant building, those are more easily moved and retain the architectural character, right? They have to go on the same orientation and things like that. There's a lot of other little details, but essentially, if it's significant for architecture, theoretically, it could be removed or be moved and retain its significant, or it's the surviving structure most importantly associated with the historic person or the event. Well, the Sandra Day O'Connor house was a location. She was prominent politically. A lot of the meetings he had about her political career and decisions took place in this house. And of course, she lived in it when she was Supreme Court Justice. And so, yeah, you can't get better than that one. So, exception, criterion B. Number C or letter C, it's a birthplace or a grave of a historical figure. Now, those are not normally um, listed, they're not normally eligible, but if it's a person of outstanding importance, right? And if there's no other appropriate site or building associated with that person. So a pretty high level here has to be outstanding, and there has to be no other appropriate site. So theoretically, that could happen. Now, uh, D, exception D, is a cemetery, not normally eligible for the National Register, but if it has primary significance because of the graves of persons that are buried there, and those persons are of transcendent importance. Again, you're talking high levels here, transcendent importance because of age, distinctive design features, or association with historic events. So there are cemeteries, and we have some. The Tempe Double Butte Cemetery is listed on the National Register, and there are others for perhaps architectural planning reasons by design, or for the important people who are buried there. So it happens, uh, probably a little more common than some of the other ones we've been talking about. E, pretty rare, is a reconstruction building, reconstructed. Doesn't happen very often that gets listed on the National Register, and I'm not even thinking. I even have an example of that one for Arizona. Um, F, a commemorative building, right? So the Lincoln Memorial commemorative building. So for that, it has to be invested with its own historical significance, and obviously the Lincoln Memorial would be. And then a G, and this is a pretty common because we're always pushing up against that a 50-year cutoff, is a property that's achieved a significance within the last 50 years, but it has to be of exceptional importance. And so that's the Gamage Auditorium example, and there are others. And of course, here in Arizona, they have some additional requirements. Is you have to get a letter of support. You have to have 5 of them actually from people, architectural historians for the most part, or architects attesting to the significance of the building if it's less than 50 years old. Which, if it's Frank Lloyd Wright, that can be done. Okay, so keep your questions. We're coming up here to the end pretty soon. Now we're back to that summary paragraph. And so, I said wait to the end. And so we're at the end and we're going to revisit this. And so by now, you should have all the pieces that go in the summary paragraph. And if you remember how we started, that was a good example one because it had all those pieces right in there. I got a couple more examples I'm going to show you, but this is the summary paragraph. And like I say, wait till you're done with all your other researching and writing, and it's a summary. So you can't really write the summary till you've done all the work, right? So it has to come last. But then it goes first. That's the first thing people read when they read your section 8. So a pro tip, write it last, but it's the first item in section 8. So a summary paragraph, you have to say why it's significant, summarize the arguments that are going to be made in your document. So this is always the hardest part. And, on the Historic Sites Review Committee, we read a lot of nominations, and I hate to tell you, but some of these are need some work. So this is a photograph of the Eisendrath house in Tempe, which is a beautiful house, architecturally significant. And so I'm going to show you the summary paragraph for that. So it's significant. It's constructed in 1930. There's the date, right? Of significance, architecture, single date. A National Register Criterion C for architecture, a specific type of architecture, Pueblo Revival style, as executed by master architect, engineer Robert T. Evans. And so then you have a significance as a work of a master under Criterion C. And you have a historic context, which is developed in the nomination, the architectural career of Robert T. Evans from 1924 to 1947. If you've ever been up there to the Phoenician Resort and seen the Jokaki Inn, that's another Robert Evans design. So that's the work of the master under Criterion C, but it's also under Criterion C as an important example of Adobe architecture, right? Method of construction. So you have a separate context there. Adobe Revival Architecture in the Salt River Valley, 1924 through 1941. So here, two contexts, one a criterion. So that one, a pretty good summary paragraph. So here's a one that actually has the 2 paragraphs, and yeah, I know it doesn't meet our definition of a single paragraph, but that's okay because there's a lot going on with this property. And this is the Arizona Inn in Tucson, which is now a boutique resort hotel that you can stay at. So it has a lot going on there. It's eligible under Criterion A for its association with the development of tourism in Tucson during the late 1920s and 1930s. So, tourism, a big thing in Tucson. Also considered eligible under Criterion B, and here's one of those rare Criterion Bs for Isabella Greenway. And most folks nowadays wouldn't know who she was, but she was a prominent politician in Arizona and a member of Commerce, uh, a member of the House of Representatives. So prominent locally and nationally for social and humanitarian concerns. So she was a builder, a businesswoman, promoted tourism, so significant for its association with her. And then also Criterion C as an example of Spanish colonial Mediterranean style architecture. So, I'm violating my own advice there because you got three things here, significant for three things. But if it's warranted and you have the time to do it, you know, why not? Um, we also have some separate stuff here because there is so much going on and had to go on a little separate summary. Period of significance, 1928 to 1938. So we have some bookends there. The first date, the construction of Mrs. Greenway's house, which became the inn. And then this one, the ending date was a 50-year period when this was placed on the National Register. Its locally significance for association of the development of tourism in Phoenix and Tucson, rather significant local example architecture. But here's the kicker: the inn is considered to have national significance for its association with Mrs. Greenway, because it's the one property most closely associated with Mrs. Greenway during historic era period of prominence. So there's another story about the Greenways, and I can tell you about that, but I'm gonna stop now because I've been going for a long time, and you guys obviously have a lot of questions. So questions, I'm open for questions at this time.
Okay. Um, there was one question, and I think maybe you covered this in the last sample that you showed. Christy said, my reviewer also wants the level of significance to be stated in the summary.
Yes.
And I believe you had done that one in
Yes.
that case. Yes.
Yeah, the level of significance should be stated in the summary because, the preparer knows best, and they should be the ones telling us what level of significance a property is. Now, that doesn't mean when it gets up to our state review board or the National Register in Washington, D.C., they could have a different opinion and it could be changed. But yeah, tell us what you think, and that way we know what you know.
I actually have one question,
Hmm.
and the property may not be familiar with many of the attendees. It was two separate buildings, and they have a shared wall.
Hmm.
I believe, well, the first one was built in, I'd say 1927, 28. Second one was built in 1949. The architect was the same architect. Naturally,
Hmm.
he updated the late 1921s. We've lost the parapets and that kind of stuff. I would say it still has the feel of a commercial building. Is that what you were trying to say when we're talking about the feel for the integrity? I mean, there's been an argument it's lost integrity, but if you look at it as the whole, it's always been a commercial property. It hasn't been moved. It's McAlpine's. Um,
Hmm.
it hasn't been moved, but in one sense, I think part of the argument would be that we're punishing either building for the fact that the architect and owner decided he needed to modernize the whole thing.
Yeah, you know, on something like that, I don't think it's an issue of a feeling. It's probably an issue of design, materials, and workmanship. So you had an earlier design with the parapets, and maybe it had windows that were time period. So maybe that stuff is lost, and so you've lost the workmanship. You've lost some elements of the design. And then you have a building next door by the same architect. Well, maybe he, within the period of significance, that's what you have to look at, is the timing of it. If it's within the period of significance, 50 years or more, then he redid it. And people change, the architects change their ideas of design. So if you have a uniform concept of design for both of those buildings, which is significant, then yeah, you could probably make a case for it retaining integrity.
Thank you. I'll remember that. Um,
Okay.
here's another one
Hmm.
from Andrea. She said, in California, the Getty and the NTHP are reopening old nominations to add prominent women in this case, California history.
Hmm.
She wondered, do you see Arizona doing that?
Uh, yeah, why not? Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And, uh, you know, it depends on, what you're doing with it. If you're adding that as a point of information or something like that, that's one thing. Um, if you're adding it as an area of significance and going to be listed on the National Register, under criterion B, that's a different story. So, it can be done. You have to, like I say, have a comparative analysis, or what are the other properties associated with this prominent woman, and are those present? Are they demolished? So it's a lot of work. I'm not saying that couldn't be done, but I would say certainly, to me, that sounds like a worthy effort.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? If you want to unmute yourself and visibilize you, we can call on you.
I
Mm,
can I can tell you about Isabella Greenway a little bit, if we have some time and people are interested in listening to the story.
I'm just seeing if there are any more questions. I
Yeah.
don't go with the story. Maybe they'll
All
come
right.
to the questions.
Yeah. Well, there's a Greenway house in Ajo. And so Mr. Greenway was a prominent mining engineer. And he passed away at an early age. And, in the prime of his life. And so his house remained, but this was in the 1920s when he passed. But Mrs. Greenway, moved on and moved to Tucson. And so we nominated the Greenway House in Ajo, and we nominated that at the national level of significance for its association with Mr. Greenway. And at one time, Mr. Greenway's statue was in the statuary hall in Congress. So he was at that level of significance. And, but, people lost track of him over the years. And, the Greenways were Democrats. And of course, that's the wrong political party in Arizona nowadays. So eventually his statue was replaced with Barry Goldwater. So they have a new statue there, and his statue was sent back to Arizona. But we nominated that under criterion B, and it was rejected by the National Register. And so then the Arizona Inn came around, and then so we did figure out a way to nominate that one at the national level of significance for Mrs. Greenway, because of her social humanitarian work during the Depression. So there's we sort of got back at him by getting Mrs. Greenway on there at the national level.
Yes.
So there's
Thank
always
you.
sort of a tendency there for the preparers to, push the envelope, and certainly Jennifer Levstek's presentation was about that. And we had another a person who worked at the Arizona SHPO, Roger Befort, and he always tried to sort of push the limit on National Register nominations and see what sort of a strange properties he could get listed. So it's an interesting thing to do if you need a hobby, I guess. I don't know.
No, we don't need a hobby, but
Oh, okay.
are you done? No one else has
I'm
asked
done.
questions, and somebody said you did too good of a job for there to be questions, and thank you. Um,
Well,
but
I'm hope open to any questions.
okay, but I wanted let those people who are still on know that this meeting has been recorded and it will be posted on the Arizona Preservation Foundation YouTube site. And we will try to let you know. We are in the process of looking for another, I think, interesting series. And as soon as that comes out, we will be sure to let you know. And thank you so much, Doug.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And thank you, everyone, for coming. See you again.